Hello again. Welcome back to the Money Corner. Tonight we're going to talk to you about a problem that plagues our economy, the federal deficit. And my guest has come from New York and joined us here in Bergen County. He's Martin Mauro. Marty is an economist with Merrill Lynch. Marty is a PhD. Prior to coming to Merrill Lynch, he was a member of the U.S. government. He worked for the Labor Department in economics. Marty, thank you for coming across the bridge and joining us here in Bergen County.
Pleasure,
Marty is Bergen County. He lives in Glen Rock. Marty, we want to talk about the deficit, and I know you've done a good deal of work in that area, as have your colleagues in the Merrill Lynch Economics Department. But perhaps before we talk about the deficit, the pros and cons, and its implication on all of us, why don't we watch a little bit of the tape that you helped prepare to help the general audience understand some of the background on the deficit. Sure. So bear with us now. We're going to leave the studio for a moment and show you some background on the deficit prepared in Merrill Lynch's studios.
And assume the presidency at a moment rich with promise. We live in a peaceful, prosperous time, but we can make it better. For a new breeze is blowing, and a world refreshed by freedom seems reborn.
A new era in American history is beginning, yet unfinished business from the previous era needs to be taken care of before we can move ahead.
We have a deficit to bring down. We have more will than wallet, but will is what we need. We will make...
Experts tell us that the federal deficit may threaten our longest peacetime economic expansion. Today, Merrill Lynch looks at Washington to give our analysis of these important issues, how they affect our economy, and you, the investor. Merrill Lynch proudly presents Investment Strategies for the Bush Era. Before the late 70s, the federal budget was generally close to balance. Deficits, spending more than is taken in, usually occurred only during recessions and wartime. When President Reagan took office in 1981, the federal deficit was already high by historical standards. The combination of a deep recession in 1981-82, a large income tax cut, and the inability of the President and Congress to come to terms on spending cuts helped to send the deficit to new heights in the early 80s. Though down from its peak in 86, the deficit remains uncomfortably high at about $160 billion. And unless the deficit is projected to be within $10 billion of the Graham-Rudman-Hollings target of $100 billion this fall, the law will require a sequestration, across-the-board cuts in federal spending, except for areas such as Social Security and net interest. Now it's up to the Bush administration, together with the Congress, to agree upon a deficit reduction package.
The budget and our fiscal decisions in Washington remain key to the economy, to the financial markets, and to individual financial decisions. On Election Day, the public sent Washington a mixed message. We elected a Republican president basically on the promise of no new taxes. And we also elected a Democratic Congress with the implicit expectation that they would maintain the various spending programs that now exist. This gives us a fundamental dilemma, and we have these ongoing enormous deficits. Why are they a problem? They're a problem because we are using an increasing share of our total savings for public dissavings, which gives our economy in the long run, not immediately, but in the long run, a bias toward less growth and more inflation. The resolution to these budget problems, not mysterious, just painful. But the public has enjoyed spending $5 for every 4 we raise in taxes. Now, everybody wants to reduce the deficit by cutting spending. Here's a pie chart that shows you just what our spending choices are in terms of where we cut. Transfer payments, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the like, 39% of the budget. And the recipient population is growing rapidly. We've indexed all of these, and nobody wants to cut those kind of programs. Defense is another 27% of the budget, and there is a consensus that says spend a lot of money on defense. We'll cut that a little bit, but probably not a great deal. Net interest is another 14% of the budget as well, and that's non-negotiable. Grants and aid to state and local governments is about 10 or 11%, and all the rest of the budget is about another total 10%. Now, in a couple of minutes, Martin Mauro, our senior economist, is going to say more about the tax side of the budget, but I think it's fair to anticipate that sometime later in the Bush years, we may have higher gasoline taxes, alcohol taxes, and tobacco taxes. The point here is we know where our budgetary receipts come from, and we know where we spend our money, and as a result, we've met the enemy, and he is us. We have used for too long budgetary gimmicks, creative accounting, smoke and mirrors, and so forth. That's part of the problem, not part of the solution. Similarly, the economic assumptions that underlie the budget are simply unrealistically optimistic, and they will lead to higher deficits than expected because revenues will be lower than we think, and outlays will be higher. You'll keep hearing more about this factor in the coming weeks and months. One other point that is important that fits with the cyclicality of the economy is that of the last 11 recessions, 9 have begun in the first year of a presidential term. I'm sure new President Bush wants to have the expansion continue through years 7, 8, 9, and 10. The last thing that he wants, because the economy affects the president's political fortunes, the last thing he wants is for the downturn to occur in 1992, the next election year. Now, how does this budget message fit with our economic anticipations? First of all, we have an economy that is growing rapidly now. It will slow its growth rate as 1989 progresses. Inflation, about 4.5 now, likely rise to 5.5 or thereabouts in the coming months, but not double-digit rates. Earnings will grow single digits this year, a little bit of a cost squeeze, so we won't get quite the lift from earnings that we have had before. And interest rates backing up a little bit now because the Fed is tightening to try to slow the economy. But later in 1989, you will see interest rates down and down a long ways.
Marty, Don gave us an outline of some of the causes of deficit, some of the problems we have. By and large, it seems to me there was some pessimism in his tone, too, about the magnitude of the problem, difficulty of solving the problem. He started off by saying we've got kind of gridlock, Democratic legislative branch, Republican administrative branch. Where do we go, and where are we going? Where do we stand?
Well, the immediate challenge is meeting the target under the Graham-Rudman-Howling law. As you know, the government has to come up with a budget that projects a deficit of $100 billion.
$100 billion when?
$100 billion for 1990.
Okay. Which might be a reduction somewhere in the area from $50 to $70 million, or depending on how you see the magnitude of the deficit right now.
Yeah, the estimates are that if there's no policy changes, the deficit for 1990 would be somewhere between $125 and $130 billion. So they have to cut, roughly speaking, about $30 billion. It's hard to do that because there are certain portions of the budget that it's difficult to touch. Social Security is a big one. President Bush has proposed some cuts in the defense budget as it existed under the Reagan years, but Congress may want even more. The point is that there's just a lot of different spending areas that have strong political constituencies, and it's hard to get any big cut in any of them.
Don concluded with the picture of the presidents that frequently we find a recession coming about in the first year of a presidential term. Does this relate to our overall problem with the deficit right now, or was that kind of a statistical aberration or a statistical phenomenon that he's pointing out?
Well, it's probably more than coincidence, and there probably is some tendency on the part of previous presidents to pump up the economy as much as they can prior to the election, and then they pay the piper in the first year of the next administration. And of course, from a policy standpoint, it makes sense from the president's political fortunes to do all the bad things first, take the lumps early, and then hopefully have things all squared away and have the economy back in good shape in time for the next election.
Is that what Don was trying to say, that the Bush people, the administrative people, now would be willing to take bitter medicine or take the lumps?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think a president ever wants a recession, and I don't think a president ever wants to intentionally.
Yeah, now let's make a
people at work,
distinction.
yeah.
At this point,
Yeah.
if we talk about recession,
Yeah.
the finger would point at the Federal Reserve Bank rather than the president.
Well, the
and the administration.
Federal Reserve Bank, which of course controls our nation's money supply, they have been tightening monetary policy considerably. Short-term interest rates are now about 3 full percentage points higher than they were this time last year. And that's being done to try and slow economic growth just enough to bring inflation down, but not too much to bring the economy
Help
to
me with
recession.
my own recollection. It's only a few months, but things get hazy. Greenspan came into office in the latter part of the Reagan days. He was
Right,
appointed by
August
Reagan
1987.
and retained by Bush, in effect. Or he's in a term that started with Reagan.
Right, it's a 6-year term, it's a 4-year term, and so
Because
he'll be coming up for reappointment.
My
later on.
recollection is that the tightening under Greenspan started in the fall, started somewhere around October, November.
There was a discount rate increase on September 4th, 1987.
So that was really the beginning of tightening.
Right, and then after the stock market break, the Fed eased considerably. They supplied a lot of money to prevent any financial calamities at that point, and then they started tightening policy once again in March of 1988.
Wait, I'm really... Greenspan was in office during August of '87, during the October break?
Yes.
So he's been in office now a year and a half. He's
Right.
been in that position.
Yes.
Okay. The point I'm really getting at, it seems to me that now as you look at the economic indicators and the statistics, the economy is slowing. And if anything, you would expect that the Fed would increasingly be in a position where they could start to loosen.
Well, I think they need more convincing signs that inflation is really moving down.
Moderating.
Yeah, we're still seeing price increases at the producer level and the consumer level that are higher than the Fed would like to see. So I don't think you'll see any easing anytime soon.
But I want to come back now once more to the deficit question. Will the domestic economy, the need for stimulation, the need for tightening, will that drive the policy towards the deficit, or will the medicine about the deficit be of its own? Does the administration have to get in a deficit reduction and forget some of the near-term consequences, which may not be possible, by the way?
Well, in a sense they do, because there is this law that says that they have to project a budget deficit that's actually within $10 billion of the $100 billion target. Now, the administration's hope, and there's, I think, some legitimacy to this, is that if they do make believable and credible progress on the deficit, that would bring interest rates down, because the financial markets, international investors will be more confident about the prospects of the U.S. economy.
Isn't it a factor, the fact that we now have Glasnost with Gorbachev and the easing of the tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, that enables Bush to take a far more pacifist role in terms of defense spending, which is one of the real factors in terms of the deficit?
I think that's more of a long-term consideration, Phil. Our budget, our defense budget, our military needs are pretty much set independent of whatever easing intentions there might be between the Soviets and the U.S. But looking over maybe over a 2-year or 3-year, 4-year horizon, certainly if Cold War tensions are eased, that would certainly be something that would help us bring the defense budget down.
Excuse me a minute. Stay with us. We're going to pause for a commercial, and you're going to see more of Marty Mauro. Now you're going to see him on tape and as part of the film, in addition to him being live here in the studio. We'll be back in a moment. Thank you for staying with us. We've got a house of cards tonight, or a house of mirrors. Marty Mauro, my guest, an economist, Dr. Mauro, PhD, member of the economics department in Merrill Lynch, is here in the studio with me. But Marty also was part of the tape you saw before about investment strategies during the Bush era and the deficit. We'd like to take a clip of Marty, and the segment that he appeared in that tape, and show it to you, because he's going to give you some very interesting background about the deficit, particularly the political ramification of the deficit. So now, Marty, we leave you in the studio and we go to Marty on tape.
Right now, Congress and the administration are working on the budget for fiscal year 1990. The Grand-Rodman-Hollings law requires that the budget project a deficit of $100 billion. The administration estimates that under current policies, the deficit would be about $125 billion. Since Grand-Rodman-Hollings allows for a $10 billion leeway, the target can probably be reached. Now, there will be disagreement about where and how much to cut certain programs, particularly the social programs, but there should be no tax increases past this year. Now, the budget that Congress works on next year will be a lot tougher. The Grand Rudman-Hollings target is $64 billion for 1991. It will be hard to get there without tax increases. We have a table that shows estimates made by the Congressional Budget Office of what different revenue-raising measures would bring. Revenue raiser is Washington's way of saying tax increase. Gasoline tax hikes would raise about $1 billion for each penny per gallon that the tax is increased. Doubling the cigarette tax gives about $3 billion. Raising the tax on beer and wine to what liquor taxes are would give about $5 billion. As you can see from the table, a way to really raise a large amount of money is to boost income taxes. Even a small increase in personal income tax rates to 16% and 30% from 15% and 28% now would raise about $30 billion in 1 year. But Congress is not likely to raise income taxes. Remember, 1990 is an election year for Congress. As Don mentioned, higher taxes on cigarettes, gasoline, and alcohol are the most likely route. The focus on spending cuts, not tax increases, is good. Any tax increase poses a risk to economic growth, especially now in the late stages of an expansion. And since an income tax increase in particular would threaten the recovery, it might not even bring in the revenues that the estimates we cited suggest. One possible tax law change of interest to investors is President Bush's proposal to reduce the capital gains tax. The President estimates that his proposal would increase revenues by about $5 billion in 1990. And indeed, by limiting the tax cut to financial assets, he designed the plan to have the maximum benefit to revenues. But many people in Congress believe that capital gains proposal would reduce revenues. Further, many in Congress object because they believe that a capital gains tax cut would benefit mostly high-income people. So the capital gains tax proposal is unlikely to pass. Turning to the spending side, one area where growth has been scaled back considerably and is likely to be trimmed some more is defense. Defense spending early in the decade rose about 7% ahead of inflation. President Bush's budget calls for defense spending to rise at the rate of inflation in 1990. The area that will be the most difficult to contain in the years ahead is spending on health care. Together, Medicare and Medicaid spending is projected to rise by 13% per year for the next 5 years. That would make spending on these programs in 1994 5 times as large as it was in 1980. One factor that would help to contain federal borrowing in the years ahead is the rising Social Security surplus. The Social Security system now takes in more in taxes than it pays in benefits. In fact, the Social Security surplus accounts for a good chunk of the improvement in the deficit that the administration expects in the year ahead. But policymakers have to be careful not to let the Social Security surplus lessen the resolve to reduce the deficit in the rest of the budget, because that would make it difficult to handle the surge in retirees in the 21st century. I'll conclude by taking a longer-term view. There's some reason for optimism about the deficit. Although it will undoubtedly be hard to achieve the Grand-Rudman-Hollings target, especially a balanced budget by 1993, it does look like the government's bite out of the credit markets will diminish. That is, the deficit should decline in relation to the size of the economy. We have a chart that shows federal deficit as a share of gross national product. The deficit is now about 3% of GNP. That's too high for this stage of a business cycle, but still, it's a lot better than in 1983 when it was 6% of GNP. With any meaningful reduction in the deficit, it should be about 2% of GNP 5 years from now. The prospect of a declining deficit as a share of GNP would help to bring lower interest rates in the years ahead.
Marty, how'd you like watching yourself on TV and then being here in the studio?
Well, it's quieter and warmer here than it was out there.
You ended on an upbeat. You see over a 3, 4, 5 year period, we're gradually going to get this problem in hand. At the beginning of the tape, beginning of the Merrill Lynch tape, the theme was investment strategies during the Bush era, or investment strategies in spite of the deficit or in light of the what looks like inflationary fires now. what are the investment strategies? Where does the investor go, and what should the investor develop as a tactic?
Well, I think the big consideration right now is interest rates.
Mm-hmm.
And our thinking is that the Fed's tightening, which has been pretty dramatic, that 3 percentage point increase in interest rates over the past year, that's going to slow the economy down, and inflation is probably not as big a problem as many people think. We're expecting inflation to start to ease off in the second half of this year, and with that, interest rates should come down. As the economy slows and inflation is less of a problem, the Federal Reserve would be in a position to ease monetary policy, bring short-term interest rates down again. So one area that looks good right now is long-term bonds. That with lower interest rates, the long-term bonds have the potential to see good price appreciation.
Well, in addition to price appreciation, help us understand this suggestion about buying long-term bonds. One of the major factors is that if on a long way out, a long horizon, interest rates are significantly lower than they are right now, then the person who is investing money in the future really has lower or reduced cash flow, gets a lesser return on his money in terms of money coming in than if he were to buy bonds right now. That really is the advantage of zeroing in on long-term bonds.
Yeah, particularly for a person with a longer horizon. Long-term bonds, 30-year Treasury bonds, are now yielding in the neighborhood of 9%. That's very high by any historical standards. We're not likely to see those kind of yields available 1 year from now or 2 years from now.
Give us a comparison. You say it's high by historical standards. Where should the long-term Treasury be by historical standards?
Well, typically it's something like 2 or 3% above inflation. Inflation right now is in the area of 5%.
So then that would lead you to think that the long-term government bond should now be around 7%.
Well, in the current environment, I mean, we're figuring 2% above the inflation rate. What we're thinking in particular is that we should see yields falling below 8% by sometime next year and approaching 7% by the end.
Now, the mathematics you use really is very, very easy. Your expectation is that if inflation, hopefully, in the United States would fall to 4%, the long-term bond rate, the government, would generate a return of about 6%, 6.5%, perhaps 7%.
Yeah, probably a little bit higher than that. I mean, there's reason to expect it to be a little bit higher than the historical norm.
Give me a number.
Well, in terms of the interest rate, we're figuring by this time next year, below 8%.
Below 8%.
On the long-term bond, yes. 7 3/4 around there.
Now, we were riding over the studio today, and I told you that one of the things that I see in my clients, people are enamored with the CD rate now at 10%. Mm-hmm. It feels like people can't get enough of them. And that could be a trap. That could be a mistake if one focuses and concentrates strictly on the short-term CD rate now.
Yeah, you have to think about what you're going to be able to invest that money in a year from now or when the CD matures. And it's quite likely that those yields aren't going to be available a year from now, the yields that you can get on long-term bonds today. And so an investor who has a large portion of their assets in short-term instruments stands to see a decline in income from the fixed income portfolio.
I have an investor who is very, very astute. The man has been doing business with me for 25 years now. And I have a lot of admiration for him. He was brought up in Germany in the 30s. And he said to me yesterday he is petrified about the outlook for inflation because of his experience in Germany. Now, as you know, you well know, you're an economist, the Germans after World War I had inflationary rates which looked like Latin America today. Their paper, their money, they pushed in wheelbarrows to buy a loaf of bread.
Right.
What is implicit in your comments about the United States, and I guess all the Western economies, is an assumption, a hope, and a confidence that we, in effect, will never become the victims of runaway inflation.
Right, and Federal Reserve policy has a lot to do with that, and in contrast certainly to the hyperinflation periods in Germany that you mentioned. The Federal Reserve is being very restrictive with its monetary policy by any measure you care to look at, money supply growth, and the other with the standard measures. So that's one thing that should keep inflation in check. And the economy is still not in any kind of overheating stage that would bring the double-digit inflation, say, that we saw in the 1970s. That just doesn't appear to be in the cards right now.
Is that one of the differences between us and the Latin American countries, the fact that we have never suffered from hyperinflation? I think we were petrified in the Carter years when inflation got up to 15%, which was back in the late 70s, correct?
Right, early 1980s.
And the medicine that we took, or the thing that bailed us out, was the restrictive policy of the Fed under Paul Volcker.
Yes.
That's the medicine we had.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, the thing that we have to couple, and this gets back to the deficit question again, what we need is the same restraint either in spending cuts or tax increases to complement the restrictive or the reins, the way the Fed runs the monetary policy.
Tax increases would probably be a mistake, at least a heavy reliance on tax increases would, just because of the danger it would pose to the economy. For instance,
Tax increases would be a danger in the economy.
Yeah, yeah. So it is a bind,
Including the sin taxes you pointed out in your tape, gasoline, beer,
I think even
cigarettes, even that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they would do less damage than income tax increases, and we're thinking that Congress and the President might be forced to accept those sin taxes at some point. But really, the best way to do it is through better economic growth and spending cuts. We really reduce the government's role in the economy, and that should be the most conducive towards long-term growth and low inflation.
And then getting back to Don Straszheim's remark, if you have gridlock with a Republican and a Democrat, that's the difficulty.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a problem that's going to be solved overnight,
Easily.
and the target of a balanced budget by 1993 is probably over-optimistic.
We're at the end. Thank you so much for being here. I've enjoyed having you. I hope you've enjoyed this show. It was innovative on our part, where we used tape from an outside source and then brought one of the character actors in. I'll be back here on the Money Corner with you again next week. Good night.